Good morning to you. It's budget week, and every year on this Sunday I interview the Chancellor of the Exchequer and I ask him lots of questions, and he says, Andrew, I can't tell you. You have to wait till I tell the House of Commons first. And so it's all a completely pointless exercise, isn't it? Well, hold on. Actually, the priorities and the instincts of this man, we don't know him very well yet, who has so much power over our money this year, really does matter. What's he actually doing in the fight against climate change? How worried is he about rising inflation? He's very rich. Does he understand how many families can't pay their bills right now? Would he back new restrictions on COVID this winter? All important questions, and ones Rishi Sunak certainly could choose to answer right here this morning. I'll be joined in the studio by Mr. Sunak later in the programme. Labour, presumably, have a different plan for the economy, but we don't know what they would do on taxes or a lot else. I'll be talking to the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, as well. And Hillary Clinton has been telling me how her life informed a new novel she's co-written with Louise Penny about terrorism and nuclear weapons.
The terrorists were always seeking that. They were on the black market. They were on the dark web. And whether it would be a dirty bomb or something more sophisticated, that would be used.
Yikes. Reviewing the news, Saffron Cordery from NHS Providers, who represent trusts in England, and Lucy Fisher, Deputy Political Editor of the Daily Telegraph. We begin, though, with the news headlines from Ben Thompson. Ben.
Thanks, Andrew. Good morning. Ministers are to formalise their commitment to a skills revolution in England, with a series of measures to be unveiled in the Chancellor's budget on Wednesday. In his autumn statement, Rishi Sunak will announce £1.6 billion to roll out new T-levels for teenagers and £550 million for adult skills. More than 2 million letters will be sent to parents and guardians across England from tomorrow, inviting them to book their children in for COVID jabs during half-term. Health officials are offering vaccinations for those aged 12 to 15, saying it will give them crucial protection ahead of winter. The film director, who was accidentally shot on a movie set by the actor Alec Baldwin, has spoken for the first time since leaving hospital. In a statement, Joel Souza thanked well-wishers for their support and said he was gutted by the loss of his colleague, the cinematographer Helena Hutchins, who was killed in the same incident. And in cricket, England have made a stunning start to the T20 World Cup. They hammered the defending champions, the West Indies. England captain Ian Morgan has said it's as good as it gets. That's all the news from me for now. The next on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. But back to you, Andrew.
Very many thanks. And as you would expect, the front pages of the Sunday newspaper, The Observer has an interesting story. Plan B is about restrictions coming in over COVID. And the paper reports that the UK's Health Emergency Committee has been in touch with local authorities to get started on that. We didn't know that. Very important story. The Mail on Sunday. At last, a minister acts on booster jab chaos. The booster jabs, because people's vaccinations are running out or losing efficacy, are really, really important for the government's plans, and they're not going fast enough. The Sunday Times, very important and interesting piece of journalism about a soldier killing a Kenyan mother. But they've also got the same story about the NHS, and they've got Sajid Javid, the new health secretary, is going to force NHS staff to have 2 jabs or lose their jobs. I'm sure we'll be talking about that later on as well. And as I said, it is, of course, budget week. Rishi's budget for a Greater Britain, says the Sunday Express, and they have a lot of detail, insofar as you can get any detail from the Chancellor ahead of the budget, inside about what his plans are. And the Mirror has a story ahead of COP26, the big climate change conference in Glasgow, coming up next week. And they say the Prime Minister has been jetting all over the place in a private jet. 21 tonnes of hot air is their unimpressed headline. Welcome to you both. Saffron, that story I started talking about in The Observer is quite an interesting indication that the government is closer to so-called Plan B than we'd realised, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is a really interesting story. So what they're doing is the UK Health Security Agency, which is now responsible for communicable transmissible diseases, is talking to local authorities and those on the front line, which is absolutely critical. I think what we've got to see here is the fact that we need the government to be making the decisions based on evidence, and I think that sense that they're reaching out now to the front line to understand what's going on is really important.
Your organisation speaks for the trusts up and down the country. How serious do you think things are? How close to needing Plan B is the NHS?
I think what we've got to look at is how things are different to last year, actually, because that's what we're basing this on. We're looking backwards so we can understand how we go forwards. And I think what's really different to last year is the vaccines. Immunity might be waning, but we do have that vaccine option now, which we didn't have last year. There are really big pressures out there on the front line. Everyone's talking about them in the papers. That's all that's there apart from the budget. And basically what we're seeing is it's not just COVID this year. It's flu, it's other respiratory diseases, and it's also urgent and emergency care, mental health care, and the need to tackle the backlog. So there's this whole bundle of issues that mean that locking down for COVID is one bit of a solution, but actually there are bigger solutions we need to look at.
Lucy, this is really, really hard for government. A lot of very interesting stuff about Sajid Javid, the new Health Secretary, how hard he is working to keep on top of this. And clearly the government are really worried about the booster vaccine rollout not being fast enough, and they're taking quite fast action to change that at the moment.
Well, that's right. I was particularly interested in the Sunday Times, the suggestion that Sajid Javid privately has said he's not opposed to lockdown over this winter, but the idea that the government want to keep a lid on all that kind of talk over the next week before 25,000 people, including global leaders, arrive in Glasgow for the COP26 summit. So it will be interesting to hear how ministers manage the story in the coming week to try to avoid spooking the horses, as government sources have told Caroline Wheeler.
And of course, Sajid Javid is talking all the time to his colleague Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, who's coming in later on. He has a difficult job, doesn't he, the Chancellor, because the huge amount of spending during the course of the pandemic now has to be accounted for, and somehow he has to rein things back ahead of the next couple of years.
Well, that's absolutely right. We know he wants to rein in borrowing. He's got limited manoeuvre room for tax rises after hiking national insurance. There is some suggestion that the better recovery than expected earlier this year means there might be as much as 20 billion extra headroom in the public finances. But he is very much constrained on the spending and the economic part of it. And then you look at the political side of it. You know, we're almost 2 years into this administration. He needs to try and spend now, particularly on the levelling up agenda. Again, there'll be eagle-eyed.
People can see things actually happening in their communities by the time of the election. There's an interesting big piece written in The Sun there. We've got your back, he says. And your own paper, or your own paper family, the Sunday Telegraph, has an interesting story. There is yet more money coming for the NHS, it says, for digitisation.
Yes, that's right. I'm interested in this Sun op-ed that Rishi Sunak's talking up his spending plans, going to give £3 billion for skills, an extra 500 million for help hard-up families with energy bills. There's not a lot of warning here of any kind of fiscal restraint, which is interesting to me. He seems to be leaning into his reputation as a high-spend chancellor. And then, as you say, the Sunday Telegraph have this interesting story about an extra 5 billion for health and social care. I think there will be some eyebrows raised in the Conservative Party over that after the £36 billion settlement unveiled only last month.
We think that nobody else is getting much money, don't we? I mean, the other departments are going to be pretty constrained, we think.
I think that's right. You know, there are huge demands, you know, education catch-up, the courts backlog, police, transport, local government budgets hollowed out. So I think there will be a lot of pressure on Sajid Javid to show how he's going to reform the NHS so it doesn't end up being this sort of fated black hole where money is just funneled in.
Saffron, you're getting the money. It's really interesting. There's a big write-up in the Sunday Times today about Sajid Javid and what he's up to, because he clearly wants to be a really hyperactive, reforming health secretary, but at the same time that involves confronting NHS staff on the double vaccination story you mentioned, and indeed GPs who are not very happy with him either.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the story in the Sunday Times probably encapsulates every problem that is facing the Secretary of State right now, and also the Chancellor. And I think it's really interesting the double jabbing for NHS staff, I think, is going to be a real hot potato. it puts on the table some real choices for staff and leaders there, and we really need to grapple with that.
And Saffron, I mentioned it's £12 billion comes to the NHS and social care per year from this new 1.5p rise in national insurance. It's a lot of money. Now, in theory, in 2025, that money starts to come away from the NHS and is handed back to social care. My question is that really going to happen?
Well, I think that's what's really interesting about this whole bundle of stories we're seeing this morning, is that what we're looking at is the need to invest in different parts of the public sector, but actually what we need to do is invest together. Yeah. If we invest in the NHS first and then in social care, what we miss is that connection between the two.
Saffron, has the NHS ever given money back?
I can honestly say I don't know.
I suspect the answer is no. Let me turn, Lucy, to another completely different story, because we should really applaud good old-fashioned journalistic investigation, good old hackery done well. And the Sunday Times has a huge story in its front page and inside about a soldier who it alleges has been boasting about killing a woman while serving abroad.
Yes, this is a story that, I must say, made me sick to the pit of my stomach to read the suggestion that in March 2012, while a group of soldiers were at the British training camp in Kenya, a soldier killed Agnes Wanjiri, a 21-year-old woman, a mother of one, who turned to sex work to feed her young daughter, and that he stuffed her body with appalling injuries into a septic tank outside a hotel where soldiers had been carousing and drinking.
Hideous story, and there's an old journalistic motto that it's always the cover-up that gets them, and there's an element of MOD cover-up in this story as well.
I think that's right. For me, I think there needs to be two things now. We know that the Royal Military Police are investigating. Certainly, we need to get to the bottom of this story. And as you say, the suggestion that everyone in this camp, even soldiers as far away as Afghanistan, knew about this soldier and the alleged allegation that he had killed a prostitute. But also, to my mind, I think there needs to be a bigger investigation into prostitution culture in the army. This talks about widespread use of sex workers, and I think that really needs to be looked into as well.
Really interesting and worrying, concerning story. Saffron, there's another story in the Sunday Times about people getting COVID after being vaccinated twice, which will concern a lot of people, but also a lot of concern, I think, in all the papers, really, about the speed of the booster rollout, which you can see has been quite slow. How important? What could the government do, do you think, to speed this up?
I think absolutely. So that the issue you talk about people getting COVID twice, even having been vaccinated, the important thing there is to remember is, firstly, we don't know the nature of this disease yet. We've only been looking at it for about 18 months, so it's really important that we keep watching it. We know that the vaccines are really important to pull back the worst ravages of COVID, so it doesn't become a killer rather than something that gives people a bad dose of an illness. But I think in terms of the rollout of vaccinations, I think they are starting to take off now. There is an issue around JCVI saying there needs to be a 6-month gap between your last jab and the new booster. So that's a really important element. So some people they're eligible, but they can't yet have it because they only had their last jab in June.
So, Saffron and Lucy, we're sadly out of time. We were going to talk about a very interesting piece in the Daily Mirror about social care, but we are out of time. Interesting. Nonetheless, thanks both very much indeed to that, and so to the weather. Now, normally I try to think of something interesting to say at this point, but the truth is the weather has been a bit dull. And it will probably carry on being dull over the next week as well. Sorry about that. Over to Thomas Schaffenacker in the weather studio. Thomas.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for that marvellous introduction. The weather is, I think, far from dull over the next couple of days. We've sunshine and showers in the forecast. It's actually very mild as well out there right now, and it will remain mild for the rest of the week. This is what's happening on the satellite picture right now, and here is our forecast. A weather front moving across the UK, bringing indeed for a time some dull and cloudy weather across central areas of the country, but then the clouds should break up to allow some sunny spells to develop, and showers also blowing in on the breeze, particularly across western areas of the UK, and really quite windy in the northwest of the country. 15, 16 degrees today's highs. Now tonight the weather remains essentially the same. An Atlantic breeze continues to blow in showers, heaviest of which will occur in western parts of Scotland, and again, a mild night. In fact, 7 o'clock in the morning, when you might be heading off to work, temperatures will be around 11 or 12 in the south. Here's the forecast for Monday. I think frequent sunny spells on the way. Showers again in the forecast, particularly across the western half of the British Isles. So the further east you are, the sunnier and the brighter it'll be. 16 possibly in London, but temporarily a little bit cooler there in the north of the country at around 11 degrees. Andrew, back to you.
Thomas, thanks very much for that. Now, my first guest this morning is the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. Rachel Reeves, we read this morning that the government is closer to bringing in Plan B than we perhaps thought. Does Labour think it's time to bring in so-called Plan B?
Labour, as a responsible opposition, have always said that we would follow the science. And we've seen today that SAGE are saying that some aspects of Plan B, like wearing masks on public transport and in shops, and also working from home more flexibly, should be introduced. I think the first thing is the government have got to do more to make Plan A work. We've only got 17% of 12 to 15-year-olds.
I'm slightly confused. Is that a yes or a no?
We think that we should follow the science. If the scientists are saying work from home and masks, we should do that. So get A working better, because the vaccination programme has been stalling. Introduce those parts of Plan B. But there are also things not in A or B that need to be done, like paying statutory sick pay from day one. And also better ventilation in public spaces.
Come on to those. I just wanted to put you something that the chief scientific advisor, you say follow the science, Patrick Vallon, said, which is very, very interesting and well put. He says, you have to go earlier than you think you want to, and you have to go harder than you think you want to. Isn't he right? And isn't it time, therefore, to just say, Plan B, its time has come? I
agree with Patrick Vallance. And the government's dither and delay risks storing up problems for the future.
You agree with bringing in Plan B now?
Well, we've always said that we should have masks on public places. So, look, I think that we should introduce those things that the scientists say, but we shouldn't take our eye off the importance of Plan A. And I do worry that it's sort of like Plan A or Plan B. You've got to have Plan A work, and we mustn't let the government off the hook there. There are millions of people who are eligible for the booster vaccine who haven't even had a letter inviting them to an appointment yet. So that wall that was supposed to be our protection, the vaccine, is in some places beginning to crumble. Plan B and those measures like mask wearing, which we should be doing, and then also things like statutory sick pay and ventilation, especially into the winter months when more people will be inside, those are crucial as well. And as Patrick Vallance says, if we don't do these things, the risk is that the virus gets out of control again, and that we have to introduce even more stringent measures, which frankly nobody wants. It would be a disaster.
I'm conscious that we're slipping into a bit of jargon here, Plan B and Plan A and all of that.
I don't care what you call it. We've just got to have something that works.
Let's remind people what it is. Plan B involves wearing masks, which Labour's in favour of, on public transport and elsewhere. Vaccine passports, you used at your conference.
Yes.
And home working, which you're in favour of. So Plan B means three things that the Labour Party is already in favour of.
Yes, and we're relaxed about that. We think the government should do it, but we don't want to let the government off the hook in terms of Plan A. And there are things in neither plan, like statutory sick pay and better ventilation, that are also needed. So call it whatever you like, but we need to do more to get on top of this virus, protect our National Health Service, and stop more stringent measures having to introduce further down the line.
For the sake of clarity, I'll call it Plan B, but can I just try one more time? You think Plan B should be introduced now?
Yes, but let's not let the government off the hook with Plan A either, Andrew.
Yes, but OK, let's turn to another big subject for lots of people watching this programme, which is the cost of energy bills. Now, you want to take VAT off those bills, at least for the next 6 months. Why?
People are facing a tough winter now, with prices of everything going up, not least gas and electricity bills. When we pay our gas and electricity bills, 5% of that money goes automatically to the taxman. There's something very simple the government could do. It would be immediate, and it would be felt automatically on people's bills next month. And that is to cut that rate of VAT from 5% to 0%. And I've been looking at VAT receipts these last few months, and VAT receipts have come in higher than forecast, not least because prices are rising so much more than forecast. VAT receipts have come in more than £2 billion above forecast. Let's use that money to ease that pressure on people who are worried about the winter months, about putting food on the table and heating their homes. This would cost £1 billion to do it for 6 months and would make a real difference to families and pensioners right now.
The only problem with this proposal, I suppose, is that it doesn't really target the poorest families very effectively. Paul Johnson of the IFS, these clever people, says the policy would be worth more in cash terms to rich households than poor households. Rich people in big houses use more gas than poor people in poor houses, and that's obviously right. So it's going to cost £1 billion, but maybe you'd be better to follow the government's sort of more targeted £500 million help for poorer families.
Well, the good thing about a cut in VAT is that it is immediate and automatic. You don't have to apply for it. There are no long lags between applying for the money and getting the support. And also, everybody is struggling with rising gas and electricity prices, but poorer families spend a higher proportion of their income on gas and electricity bills. So actually, I think it would make a bigger impact to them. But this isn't the only thing that Labour are calling for. We've said that we wouldn't have cut universal credit just a few... I mean, it is appalling that the government are taking money away from some of our poorest families right now when the prices of everything, but especially essentials, is going up. So universal credit should not have been cut, and this VAT reduction could help all families too.
Sorry, returning to your VAT cut, you've said you above all want to be known as a green chancellor, and yet you're encouraging people to use more gas.
This isn't going to encourage people to use more gas and electricity. What this is going to do is ensure that people can afford to heat their homes and keep them and their families warm this winter. I believe that the only responsible chancellor at the moment is a green chancellor, to stop the costs building up for future generations to pay, the moral imperative of tackling the climate emergency, and the opportunity to create those high-skill, high-productivity jobs in this country. You know, the government say we could improve productivity by getting shortages on the shelves. No, I say we improve our productivity by investing in the skills and the jobs of the future. And that, more than anything, means investing in carbon capture and storage, in hydrogen, in gigafactories to build the electric vehicles of the future. That's the way to boost our skills and our productivity.
How much will it cost this country's economy up front to get to net zero?
Well, at the moment, the government's plans that they put forward this week do not meet our net zero ambitions. So despite what the government have said this week, all the warm words, we are still off target.
So the answer appears to be £1.4 trillion.
Well, I've set out Labour's climate investment pledge, which is £28 billion a year of government spending through the course of this decade. And that's for three reasons. First of all, it's a moral imperative of getting there. Second, the Office for Budget Responsibility say that unless you make this investment, the costs mount up. And if you delay action by a decade, the costs of getting to net zero actually double, and our economy will be smaller and government spending higher.
I'd like to stick on the costs now, because 1.4 trillion is a 1.4 million. So it's a huge, huge sum. And a lot of people will be asking, why should we as a country spend that kind of money, borrow that kind of money and spend it, when countries like Russia and China aren't doing what they need to do? The global warming targets will be missed because of other countries, and yet here we are going first and doing it all ourselves.
But we're not going first and doing it for ourselves, because our own plans don't get us to net zero by 2050. It's another case of government with the grand rhetoric saying we're going to get to net zero by 2050. Everybody agrees that that's what we should be doing, but the plans, the concrete plans from this government, don't match the reality. And we are chair of COP26.
We are.
And we haven't shown the global leadership needed to get to net zero as a global community. But there are big opportunities.
Let me talk about another concrete plan.
Well, no, let me just say, because there are big opportunities by being a first mover in this, because we can ensure that the jobs of the future come to our shores, and then we have opportunities to export those skills and services around the world. So that's why I say the only responsible chancellor in these times is a green chancellor, and that is what I would intend to be.
Have you committed to not raising income tax?
I think I've said to you before, Andrew, we've got no plans to raise income tax. That is not on our agenda. We think there are ways to tax fairly.
So that is a commitment
and to
for the next
wisely.
election. I mean, people know obviously you're in opposition at the moment, so your plans now don't matter very much. But the Labour Party going into the election will not be raising income tax. People wondering about what should I do, where should I put my support in the next few years will want to know the answer to that.
Our concern is not about the levels of income tax.
Well,
we're happy with the levels of income tax.
Give me a straight answer. So you're not going to raise income tax. It won't be in the...
We have no plans whatsoever. We're not even looking at income tax. What we are looking at is people who get their incomes not from going out to work and doing a hard day's work, but people who get their incomes from stocks and shares and dividends and who have a portfolio of buy-to-let properties. And the problem is this national insurance rise that the government are going ahead with next April asks nothing from people who get their income in those ways.
So it should be more like a wealth tax.
That's not a wealth tax. That is about taxing income from different sources at a more equal rate. So at the moment, you pay a top rate tax of 40%, an additional rate of tax if you earn enough of 45%. And yet, if you get your income from stocks and shares and buy-to-let property portfolios, you pay sometimes just half that rate of tax. It's why at conference I said that private equity managers should be taxed at income tax levels and not at capital gains levels. That would bring in hundreds of millions of pounds every year that we've said we would invest in our young people and in our schools.
All right, Rachel Reeves, Shadow Chancellor, thanks very much for coming in to talk to us. Now then, an American Secretary of State, Hillary Rodham Clinton, had an eagle's eye view of world crises, and those experiences have been used to co-write a novel, one she's collaborated on with the author Louise Penny. State of Terror is a thriller set in an uncertain world where a Secretary of State finds herself caught up in a heart-pounding race against time. The seeds of the story were sown when Louise asked Hillary what kept her up at night when she was in charge of the State Department.
Well, I answered that by giving her 3 examples, and one of them was nuclear weapons falling into the hands of terrorists. And I knew from my time as Secretary of State, and even before that in the Senate, that terrorists were always seeking that. They were on the black market. They were on the dark web. And whether it would be a dirty bomb or something more sophisticated, that would be used.
It's not impossible.
No, it's not at all
No,
impossible.
and that's what was so terrifying, was it when she said the nuclear possibility for terrorists. And that's a terrifying idea, but it's not exactly a plot. So I said, well, how could it happen? And that's when you walked through the whole Afghan scenario, which at the time, this was 18 months, but just over a year ago, was prescient.
It is extraordinary that you describe the Western scuttle or withdrawal from Afghanistan. I just wonder how you felt emotionally when it actually happened. You'd written it, and then it happens.
Well, I was devastated, Andrew, and I have been to Afghanistan, obviously, numerous times now, and I worried about terrorists finding a safe haven again. So when it happened, as I knew it would, because of the deal that Trump had signed before the Biden administration to withdraw, it was just a matter of time. The trajectory was set. I still was heartbroken to see the impact and the Taliban turning back the clock.
Yeah, and we were actually together when that happened, and it was something to watch Hillary on the phone 8 hours a day trying to get mostly the women out.
Right.
I must ask you about the way it was written, because I've known of a lot of politicians who've written novels. I've known very few politicians who've written novels that are then readable.
Well, that's because I had a great collaborator, Andrew. Here's how we finally figured out what we were going to do, because the idea when it was brought to us, I thought was, way out there, and I wasn't sure it was a good one at all.
Neither were the publishers.
No, and they said to us, well, okay, write an outline. So that's what we did. And it got to where, I would ask a question, and Louise said, no, that won't work, but how about this? And I would say, well, okay, great. And it just became the most lively and, for me, liberating experience.
Liberating also, I suspect, because you're able to say things in fiction that you wouldn't sit down and say if you were writing a memoir.
Yes.
And there are lots of extraordinary characters. There's a previous president, who is controlled by sinister right-wing forces, and we have absolutely no idea who you're talking about.
Yes, we don't, do we? And, I have to tell you, this is a point that Louise made, which really struck me. If we had presented this outline to a publisher 5 years ago, where we had a reckless, heedless, narcissistic president who oftentimes didn't even know how he was being manipulated by adversaries from without and within, they would have said no, don't you think?
Yeah, and now what people are trying to do is figure out how much is true and how much is fiction.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In the book, we talk about the vast silence and what comes out of the vast silence, what lives in the vast silence. And I think this is partly a call to action for people to speak up. You know, there are a lot of people there who know what the truth is and who know what right is and who have chosen to prop up the big lie.
Yeah, you know, Andrew, that's the most shocking thing to me. I was in the United States Senate for 8 years. Some of the same people I served with are still there. Honestly, they're like cult members, not like leaders of a political party.
But nonetheless, President Biden's numbers are falling like a stone at the moment, and there's a lot of hard decisions to be taken about America over the next year or so.
I think we're at a point that it's imperative the president passes the legislation that he has proposed. And there are three big pieces: the infrastructure bill, what's called the reconciliation bill, which has climate and other security for family legislation, and then a voting rights bill to try to nip in the bud what some of these states are attempting to do. I served with Joe Biden both in the Senate and in President Obama's cabinet. If he gets all of this passed and he does a good job of explaining it and, claiming credit for it, I think we'll be okay.
Just coming slightly closer to home, since we're sort of sitting in London, there's another strange fictional creation, which is the British Prime Minister, who has bizarre hair, speaks in Latin a lot of the time, a bit posh, but cleverer than you think.
Well, you see, now that is very important to us. None of the characters, again, are caricatures. So, yes, he starts off being sort of a little bellicose, but then he also plays a very a vital role later on.
You've dealt with him yourself. What's your own impression of him?
I do think it's imperative that the Prime Minister do what he can to stop the rise in COVID in the UK. He doesn't need to shut the society down, but he does need to mandate vaccines.
By mandate vaccines, you mean what we would call vaccine passports, insist that people coming into buildings, into clubs, into restaurants show evidence they have
employers.
been vaccinated.
I mean, part of what we've done in New York, for example, is all of the big health systems, hospitals and the like, they've mandated vaccines. And so, for example, one very large one, 77,000 employees, 1,000 refused to get vaccinated, they were fired. And I think you've got to make it clear that we're not going to go back to lockdown. That is not going to happen. But if you don't get vaccinated and if you don't have proof of vaccination when you go into a club or a restaurant and employers don't enforce vaccines, we may see some problems here in the UK as the weather gets colder and people are forced back inside again.
Now, you mentioned the weather. Both of your countries have faced extraordinary weather situations in the past year or so, and we're just coming up to COP26, the climate conference, very, very important. Now, Hillary, you were involved back in Paris in setting the 1.5 degree goal. That is, there should be no warming higher than 1.5 degrees. This conference is meant to essentially settle how that's going to happen.
I'm very disappointed that some of the major emitters, such as China, Russia, India, will not be represented at the highest levels of their leadership. So we can have an agreement coming out of Glasgow, and I actually think we will have an agreement. I think we'll have a lot of countries showing up saying, here's, we're getting serious, we've seen the results, in our country we've seen floods and droughts and terrible intense storms and the like.
Forest fires in Canada.
The wildfires everywhere.
Horrific, yes.
So I think we will have an agreement, but if these three big emitters, most particularly China, don't come to the table, whether their leaders are there or not, and say, we got to be part of the solution, then it's not a failure for Glasgow, it's a failure for them. And they are going to reap the consequences, but so will we all.
A failure for the world if we don't keep to 1.5. That's
I think we should try. I think we absolutely should try. I mean, the pandemic was a period of lockdown, but unfortunately, the numbers coming out of the pandemic over the last year and a half show that we're even further away from reaching that goal. And so we have to increase our efforts to try to do what needs to be done.
We've talked about a lot of fairly doomy subjects just now, terrorism, nuclear terrorism, the pandemic, global climate change. Louise, in this slightly scary book, it's scary at times, is there a message of hope at the end?
There is. This is really, it is about all that you've just described, and it's meant to be propulsive and thrilling, and there are explosions. But really, you know, at its heart, it's about relationships, it's about trust, it's about friendship, and it's about courage.
Louise, Hilary, thank you both very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you, Andrew.
Hilary Rodham Clinton and Louise Penny and their new novels called State of Terror. Now, here's a brief look at what's coming up at 10:30 on BBC One.
Coming up on Sunday Morning Live, as the death of Sir David Amess prompts calls to remove anonymity on social media, we'll ask if that can really make it safer.
We'll meet the 11-year-old musical fan putting together his own charity West End Gala.
And football legend John Barnes will be discussing why his new book is prompting some very difficult conversations about race. Join us at 10:30.
Boris Johnson described my next guest, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, as a staunch, low-tax Conservative. Millions of people looking at their national insurance bills might disagree. Thousands of businesses scanning the future of corporation tax might disagree. But here we are. He joins me now. Chancellor, you wrote in The Sun this morning an interesting piece, and you said that how proud you were of the furlough scheme. And you also said, we will continue to do whatever it takes to help. We will continue to have your backs. That suggests that if you need to, you'll bring the furlough scheme back.
Well, that's not on the cards because we don't envisage having to impose significant economic restrictions in the way that we had to over the last year. And the reason for that is, although we've always said the winter was going to be challenging, the big change is the vaccine rollout, which is our first line of defence. And the best way to protect us through the winter is to get the booster campaign, making sure that firing on all cylinders, everyone gets their booster jab when they're asked, and that's as I said, that's the best line of defence against having to move to put in place any restrictions.
But no one's in complete control of what's going to happen to the pandemic, and at the moment infections, I think, in Britain are higher than in the rest of Europe put together. Hospitalisations are going up, and sadly deaths are going up as well. It may well be that we do need more restrictions. So can I ask you, is it time for Plan B?
Well, the Prime Minister actually just said that we're looking at the data all the time, as you would expect us to. We're monitoring everything. But at the moment, the data does not suggest that we should be immediately moving to Plan B. But of course, we will keep an eye on that. And the plans are ready. We outlined them way beforehand to make sure people knew what possible options would be for the winter, which we said would be challenging. Those have been set out. But again, I go back to what I said. The best protection we have against all of those things is vaccines and the booster rollout. So when people are asked, please do go and get your booster jab. And we're making it easier, for example, for parents to take their kids to get jabs over half term at walk-in centres. Those are the types of things that we're doing to help as well.
These things, however, can spiral very, very fast indeed. And I ask you again, if necessary, if you did have to bring in restrictions, would that come with a furlough?
Well, the restrictions or the Plan B that you're talking about don't involve significant economic restrictions.
No, I'm talking about Plan C. I'm talking about after that.
Well, I think that's jumping ahead a bit, Andrew. Of course, look, we should always be humble in the face of this virus. I think that's obvious, given what we've experienced. But as I said, we have confidence in the vaccines. We've modelled all the scenarios, and we've always said the winter will be challenging. And the Plan B that we set out does not involve those same type of very significant economic restrictions that we saw previously, so that it won't be necessary.
I'll come back to Plan B in a second, but the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, has said that he can't rule out another lockdown, and you said you're going to be humble. So I take it from that if it's necessary, you would bring back a furlough scheme.
As I said, we've been. I will always be humble about the face of this virus, having experienced what we have over the past year and a half. But as I said, I think we're in a very different place because of the vaccine rollout. 90% of the population have antibodies, and although the winter was always going to be challenging through a combination of different factors, that the booster rollout should give us the protection we need. And there is a fallback, there is a Plan B if we need it. As I said, the data doesn't suggest that we need it today, but if that changes, then of course the government will be ready to act. That's why those plans are there.
One thing we know about so-called Plan B, and there is a lot of jargon in this, but so-called Plan B, is that it would encourage people to work again more from home. Would you be in favour of that if that stopped the virus spreading?
Yeah, we have set out a set of plans, and obviously, depending on the circumstances, if we have to move forward in that way, then that's what we'll do. But again, I'd reiterate, so people are reassured, the data at the moment does not suggest that is immediately necessary, and our emphasis should be on making sure that everyone gets their booster jab.
Because you have previously warned that you won't get promoted if you don't come back into the office. So which is it?
No, well, I think I've made a broader point about the importance, particularly of young people at the start of their career, being able to benefit from the physical proximity you have by being in an office, forming relationships, getting mentors. Now, that is something that I would not want to lose over time, and making sure that as we have a hybrid working model, as most of us are adjusting to, then we can retain some of the benefits of that, whilst also, of course, providing flexibility that people are obviously looking for as they structure their work-life balance.
Looking at Plan B, there's compulsory mask wearing, but there's also the possibility of vaccine passports. A lot of people are very, very upset about the remote possibility of vaccine passports, but if Plan B goes ahead, they could come in quite quickly.
Well, there's a range of things that we've set out in Plan B, and then there's degrees of vaccine certification. Those debates have been had in Parliament about where's the appropriate boundary or place to introduce vaccine certification, and that, you know, there's whether it's very large events and very crowded events versus day-to-day things. And again, those are all part of the plan. And as I said, right now, data does not suggest that we need to move to Plan B. Priority should be the booster rollout. You would have seen the Prime Minister's call to arms today, and I just urge everyone to go, when they get the call, to go and get their booster jab.
We are told that we have to start wearing masks more again, and if you go outside there, you can see why. Lots and lots of people have given them up. This is about leadership. Will you start to wear masks again in the House of Commons, you personally? Well,
I think every workplace is slightly different, and people are going to make the decisions that are right for them. I do wear a mask depending on the circumstances and the settings that I'm in. I was actually just at a funeral last week where, of course, we were wearing masks given the circumstances.
Here is a little image of the front bench of the House of Commons, and there you all are. Nobody is wearing a mask. Nobody behind you is wearing one, including you, Chancellor. Now, that is a very crowded place. People are mingling all the time, and some of those corridors, some of those areas are quite stuffy in the House of Commons. It is a place where, if you're trying to show leadership, you should be wearing masks, surely.
Well, the government guidance is for people to make decisions based on what they think is appropriate for the circumstances they're in. Every workplace is going to be different depending on how many people are there, how long you're there for, whether you know the people or not, or whether, and that is all part of the government guidance.
It sounds a bit like, you know, do as I say, not as I do. Jacob Rees-Mogg, the leader of the House of Commons, famously said this week, "We on this side have a more convivial, fraternal spirit." Does a convivial, fraternal spirit give you immunity against coronavirus?
I think people are going to make the decisions that they think are the most responsible ones. For example, if I'm in a train or a crowded train carriage, I would be wearing a mask. As I said, I was just at a funeral this week where, as you would expect, people wearing masks. I was wearing a mask. People will make the right judgments depending on the setting that they're in.
Well, coming on to the economy, but a very straightforward question. You've mentioned the booster rollout, etc. Does a smooth economic winter depend upon a speedier booster rollout?
No, I think actually we should have confidence in the booster rollout. I think already half of the over 80s have had their booster jab. 5 million have been delivered in total. We have 500 more sites than we did, I think, in the spring. So, and as I said, we're making some changes to make it easier for parents to take their children to walk-in centres over half term. So actually, the focus is on making sure the booster rollout happens smoothly, and I think we can see that. That is happening as we speak.
Let's turn directly then to the budget which is coming. Can I ask you, is this going to be a big spending bells and whistles budget, or is it going to be a more cautious belt-tightening kind of budget?
Well, if I take a step back, over the last year and a half, my focus has been on delivering our plan for jobs, making sure that we protect people's jobs and livelihoods, and I'm glad that plan has worked. Unemployment is far lower than anyone feared. The economy is recovering quicker than we thought. Now, next week's budget is about looking to the future and building a stronger economy for the British people. Now, what does that mean? That means strong investment in public services, driving economic growth by investing in infrastructure, innovation and skills, giving businesses confidence, and then supporting working families. Those are the ingredients of what makes a stronger budget, and that's what we will deliver next week.
Is austerity coming back?
As I said, one of the elements of building a stronger economy is having strong public services, and you will see that next week, whether it's the NHS, which we've already taken steps to support significantly to recover from coronavirus, children, schools, skills, all of these things, policing and crime. You will see investment across the board in public services, because that's what we were elected to deliver, and that's what we are getting on and doing.
Let me ask you about one of the big challenges that you face. I think everybody is wondering about inflation at the moment. It's clearly going up. The Bank of England has said it could touch 5% by the end of the year. There are two views of this. One, it's a blip caused by the unwinding of the coronavirus pandemic and the problems around the world, and it will pass quite soon. Other people think, no, 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 we are entering a new era where inflation is back again. Which do you think?
Well, what I could say to people is if you take the last inflation number, which was just over 3%, which is obviously higher than we normally target, and you look at what's causing that, the bulk of that increase is down to two things. One of those is the fact that as economies have reopened rather rapidly after coronavirus, that has put pressure on global supply chains. And then the other part of the increase is very much just down to energy prices. Now, both of those...
You can't do much about either of those.
Well, that was what I was going to say, is both of those factors are global factors. We're not alone in experiencing those problems. You know, I don't have a magic wand that can make either of those things disappear. I talk to finance ministers around the world, and all of us are grappling with similar challenges. But where the government can make a difference, of course it will and it should. So, for example, on HGV drivers, we've taken a number of steps to smooth that process, get more people in, make it quicker, invest in training. Those are the types of things.
How many have arrived here from the continent so far?
Yes, obviously we've made available. I don't have the latest number on the one that was reported the other week, but that's just one element of the plan. And actually, people were calling for us to make available more visas, which we have done. But
27 people have picked you up on that.
Well, but we are also, Andrew, investing in speeding up the process. Becoming a driver, speeding up testing capacity. The Transport Secretary has done a fantastic job. We're investing in skills, so skills boot camps and apprenticeships to help train people to become drivers. Those are all the types of things we're doing, and we're doing all of them.
You're putting quite an effort onto these so-called skills boot camps, which are a sort of short-term way of getting people's skills up and getting them into work. Now, the only piece of research or data that we can see on this comes from the Department for Education, which followed a large number of people through a skills boot camp of the kind that you're talking about. 69 people finished that boot camp, got the qualification, got the certification. How many of those people do you know got jobs?
I haven't seen that particular report.
The answer is 3. Less than 5% success. So if this is going to be how you spend your money, the boot camps are going to have to be a lot more effective than the pilot schemes, aren't they?
Yeah, so we are rolling them out, and actually these are based on evidence from around the world, particularly in America actually, where more sector-oriented training schemes have been shown to be really powerful. So rather than just people sitting in a classroom by themselves doing skills, what we know is partnering with employers to do short interventions of 3 to 4 months and ending with a job interview at the end is a far more effective way to help upskill and retrain people into well-paid jobs, whether it's in cyber, nuclear, AI, to give you 3 examples.
I'm just saying, in the British version, 81% of people went through it and didn't get a job, so there is a problem with this scheme.
Well, actually, I think that one particular thing that you're referring to, I'm not familiar with. In general, all of these skills boot camps involves job interviews that come towards the end because we do them in partnership with employers.
But you're right, didn't get a job interview.
On that particular one, but in general, these are proving to work very successfully, and actually tens of thousands of people are already going through them. But remember, they are just one part of a set of interventions we're doing. The Prime Minister's Lifetime Skills Guarantee means that for the first time, 10 million adults in this country who don't have a level 3 qualification, which you get when you're 18 typically, will be able to get one funded by the government. We know that that's transformative for their ability to get a new job and earn more. Those are many things that we are doing.
The Prime Minister and you as a government talk a lot about it being a high-wage economy. Should people watching this programme go to their bosses tomorrow and say, I need a pay rise?
No, getting to a high-wage economy, the best way to get to a high-wage economy is to improve people's skills. It's to give them the opportunities to retrain and upskill and to help businesses drive up productivity.
Rising. How long does that take?
Well, in order for and also businesses to invest in productivity, which we're also doing by giving them tax cuts to invest. Now, those things, of course, happen over time, but we've taken steps. For example, the national living wage went up last year, and we're seeing it in the data. Real wages today are higher than they were before the crisis. So this is happening, but in order to make it sustainable long term, the best way is to invest in skills.
One area where you do have, as it were, complete control about what to do is public sector wages. Public sector wages are rising below inflation at the moment, 2.5% or so. Are you going to raise the public sector wage bill by inflation at least?
So that will be
to get us to a higher wage economy.
That will be one of the things that we talk about next week in the spending review, Andrew. Obviously, over the past year, we took a decision to have a more targeted approach to public sector pay, given that the year before there were large increases, and obviously the private sector was seeing pay decreases last year, and people were on furlough. We thought that was reasonable and fair. Now, going forward, we'll have to set a new pay policy, and that will be a topic for next week's spending review.
You have portrayed yourself as it were, as a Thatcherite Conservative. You've got Nigel Lawson's picture in the Treasury and all the rest of it. That is a lower tax, smaller state chancellor. Does it make it very hard to do that when you've got such a high-spending, boosterish neighbour living next door?
I think, the challenges that I've had to deal with over the past 12 to 18 months have been ones that, of course, I wish I didn't have to deal with, but that's the reality of the situation. We've had a once-in-300-year economic shock. That necessitated, rightly, a very significant response from the government to support country and families and businesses through that crisis. And obviously, as we've discussed, we've got ambitions to invest in public services and to drive up our growth by investing in infrastructure, innovation or skills. Those are the things that I'm juggling. And I wish I wasn't. I wish I didn't have to deal with coronavirus and everything that we've done and borrowing that was at a World War II levels.
Sure.
But that's the reality that I face, and it's right that I tackle those challenges and make sure that the economy is strengthened, and that next week's budget will deliver that stronger economy for the country.
Do you agree with the Prime Minister, therefore, that raising national insurance is the best way to fund the National Health Service and social care?
Yes, I think we did a difficult but responsible and right thing to do. The NHS backlog was going to grow to unacceptable levels. We wanted to make sure that we could get the
quite
NHS...
regressive as a way of raising the money.
No, actually, it's a progressive way to raise money, and whether lots of independent bodies and think tanks all did say that it was a broadly progressive way to raise money. The top 14% of people on national insurance will account for over half of the revenue from
we're
it.
talking
And
about
actually,
the Resolution Foundation and people like that.
yes, many of those people all use the word
And the IFS.
progressive to describe that way to raise money, because it is those with the broader shoulders will pay the most.
As you would expect, we went on to read the rest of the report. The Resolution Foundation then went on to say straight away, but there are also tax rises that too narrowly fall on the earnings of the working age population. And the IFS said it is disappointing the government did not find a better package of tax measures to fund these spending increases. A simple increase in income tax would have been preferable.
So let's take that as an example. Now, look, believe me, I wish I didn't have to raise taxes. There's no easy or good way to do it. So you're choosing between, degrees of unpalatable options. Income tax versus national insurance. Reasonable question to ask. If you use income tax rather than national insurance, there's a couple of big differences. The first is that income tax doesn't involve businesses. Therefore, the rate that you would have to levy on people would be higher. So instead of 1.25%, the rate would have been the rate would have been over 2%. You've talked about the impact on families. So instead of a typical basic rate taxpayer earning £24,000 paying about £180, they would end up paying closer to £350. So the burden on them would be significantly higher if you were using income tax. So we should bear that in mind. I think the other thing with income tax is it is not a reserved tax. It's not a reserve tax for the UK. We want to do this on a UK basis. The National Health Service is a UK institution, and it was important for us to do that on a countrywide basis. Income tax has been devolved, so we wouldn't be able to do that. And lastly, there's a long history and tradition in this country of using national insurance to fund the health service. Indeed, when it was set up in the 1940s, it was done to do exactly that. Today, when people pay their national insurance contributions to HMRC, a portion of that money goes direct from HMRC to the NHS. That doesn't exist for income tax.
They're funding the health service with this, but we were told we were going to be funding a massive change in social care. Now, of the £12.5 billion that's being raised each year from this new tax rise, by 2025, how much of that is going to go to social care?
Well, I'll leave the Health Secretary to set out the detail of the plans, but as you know...
Will any of it go to health?
Yes, of course it will, but the plan is in the short term, when there's a call on the NHS to help with the elective backlogs, right? More of it will go to the NHS. And then, obviously, that won't carry on forever because we will get the backlogs down.
To interrupt, but you really expect the NHS to say, it's all right, we've got enough money, here's some money back. It's never happened before.
Well, we do have a Secretary of State who's the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, and actually part of the answer here is not to view these things in their silos and to realise that the way to deliver better social care is actually to have a more joined up, integrated approach on the ground, and that involves social care and the NHS doing more things together, decisions being made together, and that's what the Health Secretary is determined to deliver, to make sure that people's experience on the ground improves.
I asked you about being a tax-cutting chancellor. I'm not going to be silly and ask you what you're going to announce to the House of Commons next week, but may I ask you this? By the end of this Parliament, are you going to be a tax-cutting chancellor?
Again, thank you for not asking me specifically about next week. But Andrew, again, I'll talk about that next week at the budget. But as
broadly speaking, lots of Conservatives will be watching this saying, is he a tax-cutting chancellor or is he not? Is he a big state socialist?
Hopefully not just the Conservatives, but everyone else watching can also tune in and watch the budget actually on Wednesday, when I'll talk about, obviously, our plans on tax and spending. That's what it's there for. But look, I appreciate...
You can't tell me whether you're going to be a tax-cutting chancellor in principle by the end of this Parliament.
As we were discussing previously, of course, my instincts are to do that. That's what I believe. I want people to be able to keep more of their money. I want to reward people for working. I think that is a good thing, and I think that will help drive economic growth. But as we discussed, I've also had to grapple with an economic shock, the biggest in 300 years, borrowing the highest since World War II, and things like the elective backlogs in the NHS being at record levels, which we want to make progress on. Those are some of the challenges in the short term.
Let me ask about one specific and very focused challenge. There's a really interesting letter in the Sunday Times this morning from Marcus Rashford and the heads of quite a few of the big supermarket chains, and it's talking about the National Food Strategy and free school meals for relatively poor off children. And they say this has to be extended, and it has to be extended into the holiday period. Otherwise, failure to do so, they say, will both deepen and extend the scarring caused by the pandemic on our youngest citizens. That's a very straightforward, relatively inexpensive, about 1% of the education budget thing that you could do, and you could say you're going to do now.
So we put in place some measures to help families during coronavirus. That was the right thing to do. And in common with the other things that have now come to an end, whether it was furlough or other things, that's right that we've transitioned to a more normal way of doing things. But we have actually already acted, is what I'd say to Marcus and everyone else. We've put in place something called the Holiday Activities Programme, which provides not just meals but also activities for children during holiday periods for those families that need extra help. That is a new programme. It was announced earlier this year. It's being rolled out across the country, and I think that can make an enormous difference to people. OK, we've talked about inflation. Let's turn to another of the really, really big challenges facing you and facing the country, which is net zero, decarbonising the economy. You produced a very, very interesting 135-page report about this, and the one thing that seems to be missing from it is any figure for the upfront cost to the British economy of getting to net zero. So can you tell me what that figure is? Yeah, I think as the report says in the 130 pages, it's very difficult to put a single figure on something that's going to happen over over 30 years, 3 decades. During which lots of things are going to change, not least the cost of many of these technologies. So, it's hard to reduce it to one single figure. I'm sure it is difficult, but the Climate Change Committee managed to do it, and your predecessor, Philip Hammond, managed to do it. And they both came up with more or less the same figure, £1.4 trillion, a trillion being a million. Can I put it to you, the reason that figure is not in your document is that it's simply too scary? No, again, I think that something that happens over 30 years, the transition of an entire economy, I think it is tricky to put a precise figure on it. And that's why I said what I would point you to, though, is the investments we're making and the plans that the Prime Minister set out earlier this week to invest £30 billion over this Parliament in helping with that transition. Sure. And actually was described by, I think, even one of your own commentators here on the BBC as one of the most comprehensive plans of any advanced economy. So people should feel reassured that we're making progress. I'm just wondering about the realism and the practicality of this, because we're told that millions upon millions, I think 24.5 million households in this country are going to have to rip out their gas boiler and put in heat or air pumps, and that means new water tanks, that means new radiators, new piping. It's a very, very expensive thing. Even if the cost is halved, it's going to cost more than £5,000 per family. And just looking at household budgets and saving levels in this country, I just put it just the kind of thing that people say ahead of a big climate change conference, but it's not going to happen. As soon as the circus rolls out of town again, this is going to be dropped. Well, no one is being told to rip out their boiler. Let's be clear about that. That's not what the plans say. There's a range of things that will happen over a period of time. But what there is support for people who are contemplating doing that now. There will be extra support, these £5,000 vouchers that people have now heard about, which will help offset some of those higher costs. And the reason to do that... Very expensive, and lots of people don't have the money to do it. No, but no one is forcing them to do it. Let's be clear that they are not being told to rip out their boilers. But the reason to put the incentive in place is for those who do want want to do it, this will be extra help for them and will help kickstart a market which will, we hope and believe, bring the cost of these down. And indeed, that's what we've seen with other technologies, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, whether it's electric car batteries. The cost of all of those things has fallen dramatically over a relatively short period of time as we've scaled up.
We're pretty much out of time, so I'm looking for a very, very brisk answer from this last one. COP26 is coming up. If it doesn't agree and show how we're going to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees, has Glasgow been a failure?
No, I think Glasgow will be a success, particularly on the finance side, which I'm responsible for.
Do we have to stick to 1.5 degrees, is my question.
We are making enormous progress. All I'd say, if we've got very brisk answer, I'd say this. When we took over the COP presidency, just 30% of the world's economies had net zero targets in place. That is already up to 80%. We've played a part in making that happen, and there's more to come over the next couple of weeks, and I feel confident that we'll have a good summit.
1.5 or not?
We're making very good progress towards it.
It's interesting you can't say that. All right, that's all we've got time for. Thanks all from all of us this week. Next week, we have got that big climate change conference in Glasgow, which will be dominating the news by then. Will it be a success or a failure? And what will it mean for you? We'll be doing our level best, as usual, to get you the answers. Goodbye.